Hey you, and welcome. In this video, we will look at file structure and the folder structure for the React.js app that we had created in the previous video. So let's dive right into it. So remember in the previous video when we created the React.js app, it was called My App, and I opened that in VS Code. So let me just zoom in a little bit. Yeah, that's good enough. And that's the folder structure on the left-hand side. Remember, the node modules will always be the area where you have all the NPM packages that are required to run your project. So I'm not going to go over too much into that. There is now a public folder, and the public folder is what gets served to the internet. So internet is going to receive Favy icon. Fav icon is just an icon that the browser uses to show you that tiny little icon that you see on every browser at the top left-hand corner. You see in this case there is a black with a black circle with a green triangle, or the React icon for the other browsers. So those are Fav icons. Go back to my VS Code. Then we have the index.html. That's the HTML file. As soon as somebody goes to the project, in this case when we went to localhost 3000, index.html got served, and this is what the index.html looks like. We're not going to be writing too much HTML. We'll be using JSX, so we won't really be making any changes to this file. But one thing to note in here is if I scroll down, there is a root div. This comes in to play when we start looking at the JS folder of this structure. But for now, just know that there is a div in the index.html that has the ID of root. All right. I'll go ahead and close this. That's just an HTML file. Gets served. It's an empty HTML file. And I'll go to logo 192 and 512. Those are just logos that are being served up. This is just an image asset, nothing much to it. 192 pixel versus 512 pixels. That's why they're named accordingly. A manifest in JSON. We're not going to be working too much into it, but for progressive web apps, you go into this file to make changes so that you can make it look a certain way on mobile, or certain assets can be uploaded. In this case, there's already some information uploaded for me. I don't think I need to change that, so I'll go ahead and close this out. And robots.txt, that's the file that needs to be served for the Google robot or any search engine robot to go to the website and see what the website is about, so we can have good SEO, search engine optimization. All right, with that done, I'll close the public folder. So remember, public folder is the one that gets served to the web. Our code for React.js lives in the src folder. So if I open that up, there's a bunch of files in here. Let's go step by step. So I will combo these up together. So there is an index.tsx. Remember, we're working with TypeScript template here. So TS was a TypeScript file. TSX is a TypeScript file with JSX allowed in that. We will be looking at JSX in depth later on. Let's take a look at index.tsx first, because that's the entry point here. In the index.tsx file, that's where the first render happens. So in React.js, render is when the empty HTML that we just looked at, render would go into that HTML and just make an append or add a component to it using JSX element that we provided. In this case, we are providing on line number 10 and line number 14. We're doing root render. Root is something that's coming from create root, which is from the React DOM library. So React DOM library would give us a create root, and then we will provide it which element to work with. Remember, in the HTML file, we had a root div. So that's the one it's targeting, and it's saying for that root div, that's the one that I want to target, and create a React.js root element and assign that to a constant for root. And then using that constant, I would say root.render, and then you can render anything in there you'd like. This is the syntax for JSX. Of course, we'll look more into that in a bit, but this is the syntax for JSX, where it looks pretty much like HTML. However, it has none of those elements that HTML has by default, like div, a tag, or p tag, any of those. It has custom names, in this case, React strict mode and app. And app is coming from /app, ./app. That means it's a relative path from my src folder. There's an app, which right here I can see there's an app.tsx. That's the one it's referring to, and it's rendering that out. So let's dive into that next. So in app.tsx, I am importing React We have logo coming in. It's an SVG file. On the web, we would serve images using different formats, lighter formats, not just JPEG or GIF that you may be seeing in other places. We work with SVGs or PNGs. In this case, SVG is the one that we're working with, and this is an image file. And there is a CSS file as well. We won't be working too much with CSS. We will work with a design system instead that will make it easy for us to design our website rather than having to write CSS from scratch. More on that later. And then a React component is always a function. There is class components. We won't be covering those. Nowadays, it's all about function components, so that's what we're going to stick with. A function component is just that, a function keyword, name for the function, parentheses, curly braces open, and then it returns a JSX. So this should look familiar because this is actually using regular HTML tags, along with the minor differences. Instead of class being called class, it's called class name. We're going to talk about that in a bit. And it exports as default the app component or the app function, which is basically a component now. In React.js, a function is a component. So is exporting that as default, and in index.js, we're importing that as app from the app TSX and rendering that out. So that's the whole life cycle of what we're seeing so far. And if you look at in the Firefox, the logo that is rotating, edit SRC, this message right here, and the learn React hyperlink, that's coming from app.tsx. And this should make sense now because there is an image tag that is giving the logo using SVG. It's an animated SVG, that's why it's rotating. There is a message in the P tag, edit SRC, so that's where the message is coming from. And there's an A tag that gives you the hyperlink. So app.tsx is where the actual render is coming from. If I was to make any changes here and save, notice if I go to Firefox again, it should automatically be changed. To make this happen, to have a live dev server going like that from scratch, it would require a little bit of effort, but Create React App creates a very nice developer environment for us, which comes with something called hot reloading and refresh. So in this case, hot reloading is what happened where I just saved my file and automatically server picked up on that and said, I'll go ahead and refresh your page for you so you don't have to keep going back and refreshing it every time you make changes to it. So just a nice addition to your development environment. All right, I'll close that out. We won't be working with test here, so I'll go ahead and delete that. We won't be working with CSS files, so delete that. And I will delete reference to that in the app.tsx. There is a reference to CSS. I'll delete that. Perfect. And index.css, I'll delete that as well. And index.tsx, there's a reference for that. I'll go ahead and delete that as well. Great. All right, what else? We have report vitals. I'm not going to talk about that. Setup tests. We can keep it there, but it's for unit testing. We're not going to be covering that. I'll go ahead and close the SRC folder. That's about it for that folder. Next, we have the git ignore. We did cover that in the previous videos where we can see the files that don't need to go to GitHub. In this case, node modules is right at the top. That's always the default. There is also a build folder. We will be talking about that when we create a production build, how the build folder doesn't really need to go to GitHub. It should go to a hosting service instead, unless GitHub is your hosting service for some reason, then maybe you push it up there. And some other env files that we may be working with in the future to create environment variables. We will talk about that in the later videos. And then we have package lock, package JSON. We have worked with those before. You can see in package JSON, we have tons of dependencies already installed for us. Some of those dependencies are types, which are basically TypeScript types that are coming from different libraries, or React library is there, React DOM is there, React scripts is there. So tons of libraries automatically added for us. And there are a few scripts. We just used one using npm start, which created the server for us and started the web server. There is a build command that we can build a production build with. We will be using that in the future. And a test and eject, we won't be working with those too much. All right, with that out of the way, let me close a few files. What else do we have? We have a README. Oh yeah, the README is very cool. They already have it filled out. I'm going to open my preview using my Markdown preview. And this is what the README looks like. It's very, very useful right off the bat. They have tons of content in there to tell you how to run the server, how to test your code, how to run the build command, what happens after the build command happens. So tons of information there. Definitely keep that. And tsconfig, that's the configuration file to have the TypeScript working in our project. and defaults are good. Not going to get too much into detail in that. Just remember that tsconfig in your project means there's a set of rules that you have to follow to make the TypeScript work. In this case, by default, TypeScript is set up for us. All right, with all that files and folder out of the way, I'll see you all in the next video.